on the news. I mean, every day the New York Times has several articles on this issue. And it's a topic that is a very 21st century topic. It's a topic that goes back to the 19th century in Latin America, boom and busts in commodity prices. But in the 20th century, we have had already a boom and a bust. But what is intriguing is that not every country has reacted equally, right? In Mexico, they didn't feel it. Well, you can say that Mexico is not much of an exporter anymore. But Colombia, that is, hasn't been affected that much. On the other hand, Venezuela has been quite dramatic. And Brazil also quite dramatic. Chile, no. Bolivia, not particularly, in terms of the political ramifications of these things. And we have the perfect person to enlighten us on this conundrum. Michael Penfold is a professor of political economy at the Center for Public Policy and Competitiveness in the Instituto de Estudios Superiores en Administración, Caracas. He's the former director of the public policy at the Corporación Andina de Fomento, CAF, which is part of the Development Bank of Latin America. I don't know what the relationship is. Founder and executive director of Strata, Apoyo Empresarial, an advisory consulting firm. He holds a Ph.D. from here in political science, right? And has been a visiting professor at SIPA, at USC, at Sciences Po, which is the premier institute in France for political studies. And he's also the co-author of The Dragon in the Tropics, The Political Economy of Revolution in Venezuela, Brookings Institution, which was selected as best book by Foreign Affairs for the Western Hemisphere. So thanks a lot for coming again, and I hope you keep on coming.
Thanks, Jose. It's a real pleasure to be here and be back here in this room, and see good friends like Al here. It's a real honor to share this opportunity. I think it's what's happening. Obviously, the focus of my presentation is very much centered around Venezuela. But I think if you are trying to understand what's going on in Venezuela and elsewhere in Brazil, with the impeachment process of Dilma, with the changes in Argentina from the Kirchner to Macri, if you look at what's going on in Bolivia, where Evo for the first time lost it was not exactly an election, but a referendum on term limits. If you see Ecuador, where Correa for the first time is self-constrained to the idea of staying in power and actually thinking about how to extend term limits without necessarily staying in the presidency. And you look at the results in Peru, the most recent ones, with Humala and the left, basically losing against PPK and Keiko. You have a very interesting region that is responding in very different ways to the change in the terms of trade due to the decline in commodity prices. And this is particularly interesting because I think for two reasons. One, because for the first time, this cycle is taking place in countries where democracy, with some few exceptions, obviously Venezuela is one of them, where democracy is fully consolidated. And also in the context of a region that in the last 10 years grew at an extraordinary pace, and not only managed to see interesting growth rates. We saw an expansion, a tremendous expansion of the middle class. We saw a region that also reduced poverty rates, although not necessarily inequality rates. And we saw also some of these countries pursuing important fiscal reforms, particularly countries like Colombia, for example, and Chile, that were pursuing that pursued interesting changes in fiscal rules and so forth. And in addition to that, we saw also a region that was attracting very important substantial amounts of FDI. Over to $120 billion a year were coming into the region. So this sort of external shock that the region has been living for the last year and a half or so, almost 2 years now, where commodity prices have been going down, I think has played out in very different ways in different countries. And I think to look at Venezuela without understanding the broader picture, I think we might be losing some very interesting information at least. I think there are three factors. One factor obviously has to do with the relationship between commodity prices and growth. Many of these countries in the last decades were growing because they improved their terms of trade, not only because they became more productive. And in some countries also it had to do with fiscal spending and the way how the commodity cycle made these countries fiscally more pro-cyclical. So they spend it more along that they were gaining a larger income due to this reality in the international economy. But I also think, and obviously when you look at the correlation between commodity prices and presidential popularity, and this is, there are many studies for Brazil, for Argentina, I've done some for Venezuela, you see important correlations going on. But I think this is not the only part of the story. I think the other part of the story has to do with two very important factors. One is term limits. I think, for example, that the story in Argentina, Macri being able to win the presidency, is not only a story of a difficult time given changes in commodity prices. It also has to do with the fact that you had a term limit for Cristina's presidency, and that incumbency advantage was not there in the combination of this commodity decline, sort of facilitated this kind of transition. So the term limits and the timing in terms of the electoral cycle is important. In some countries like Argentina, this decline was coming close to the end of a presidential period. In other countries like Brazil, for example, or even Venezuela, it was actually coming in at the beginning of a presidential period. So this implied different. I think the timing of the decline in the commodity prices, along with the term limits, I think is an important factor. And then the third factor that I think is actually very interesting to look at is social mobilization and protest, and particularly the role of the middle class throughout the region in these protests. This urban middle class. It has been particularly important in countries like Brazil, for example. It's played an enormous role also in Chile. And even in countries like Colombia, for example, it's increasingly playing a very important role. Not all countries are seeing that kind of social, sort of political and social mobilization. And in fact, for example, curiously, in Venezuela, you haven't observed that as that kind of mobilization as you saw, for example, or you're observing in Brazil. So there's a puzzle there. There's a puzzle. I don't have a clear answer to it, but I think what you're starting to look at is this variation within the electoral context of the region, of how not only presidents but society and opposition forces are reacting to this new context. I think they're different. As I said, I think term limits and the timing within the electoral cycle is important. But I also think that the fiscal side is tremendously important. Those countries that, in fact, during the last 10 to 15 years, managed to put forward substantial fiscal reforms that allow them to save for, bad times, which is the case of Colombia, which is the case of Bolivia, which is the case of Chile, which is the case of Peru, have managed so far to cope with this situation from a political perspective in a better way. And other countries where these reforms were absent, or even fiscal rules were disappeared, like, for example, which is the case of Venezuela. The impact of this commodity crisis was much larger, and therefore more disruptive from a political point of view. So I wanted to start off looking at the Venezuelan case from this sort of broader regional perspective, and sort of take you through what's happening in the country. And first of all, I want to talk about the size of the economic crisis. And actually, I'm starting to have problems talking about a crisis because it's really an economic collapse. It's more than a crisis. But the size of this situation, particularly when you analyze it from an external point of view in terms of the financing requirements that Venezuela currently has, are tremendous. Then I want to talk about how this economic situation translated itself into the political conflict between Chavista forces and opposition forces through the legislative elections that we had in December 6th, that in many ways was a watershed moment in Venezuelan politics, but that has proven also to get the country into a political basically a political deadlock in terms of the ability of the country to respond in some way to the size of this crisis. And then I want to talk a little bit of where we are standing today in terms of where the country is heading, in terms of the political process, the different scenarios that you might be observing in the next year or so. So let me start with the economic context. Just to give you an idea of where we are. In terms of income, Venezuela was receiving at the hike of the oil close to $100 billion a year in income through exports in oil, which represent 95% of the exports. Today, this is a little bit over $35 billion. So that is, we've basically observed a contraction of Venezuela's exports by a third. And basically, this is a country where the fiscal deficit of the state is 20% of GDP. It's just huge. This is a state that when Chavez arrived in 1998, the size of the state was 21% of GDP. And by the time Chavez died, the size of the state was close to 42% of GDP. So this is a state that basically doubled its size during the boom era, okay? This is also a country with multiple exchange rates and a controlled exchange system that's created all sorts of distortions, particularly price distortions. And in fact, by the time that you had the oil bust, price system in Venezuela had basically collapsed. So it's not working. You had arbitrations of different sorts, and basically the only game in town was arbitration. That is, whether you had access or not to the subsidized dollars that the government was paying. So this created enormous external constraints. So Venezuela is facing an enormous external constraint on its economy, and at the same time it's also facing a very Byzantine regulations and controls in its economy. Last year, the financial needs, and this let me add to this, that it's not only that the state expanded its size, or it's that you increase the level of foreign debt tremendously, both from PDVSA and the state, the sovereign, during the last 10 years. And in fact, just to give you an idea, what Venezuela has been doing is basically using its international foreign reserves and some assets that it still holds to get the financial requirements it needs to address some of these imbalances. Last year, Venezuela was needing over $25 billion in financing. This year, Venezuela requires $28 billion in financing. And we're talking of financing in a moment where Venezuela has basically no access whatsoever to financing in capital markets. So you have, that's true for the state, and that's true for PDVSA. So, well, how has the government been coping with this shock? It's basically what it's done. It's something I don't think I've ever seen before, or at least I've never heard or read about it. But this is a government or a country that was importing over $60 billion in 2012. And this year, it'll end up importing close to $21 billion. So this implies a massive contraction of imports that is quite impressive to watch. In a moment where local production is basically also collapsing, and in a moment where you have inflation rates reaching over the 3-digit numbers. So this is a government basically that has been adjusting by quantity, just reducing the size of imports without using any kind of price mechanism to sort out the whole the whole process. I think that's one way of how other countries in South America particularly have adjusted to the decline.
Michael, sorry, the 28 billion needing finances for investment, or?
No, the 28 billion is basically to cover the imports requirement plus the capital and interest payments in debt.
Okay.
Okay. So basically what you have is a very interesting way of how a very difficult one, but it's interesting to see a country that basically was able to reduce the size of imports the way it has. It's also the other thing that the government has been doing is obviously using its position in foreign reserves. But foreign reserves in Venezuela are not very liquid. They're mostly in gold. The cash position in those reserves is not very large. And Venezuela did not have, an impressive position in terms of international reserves. Like, in fact, when you compare it to Brazil, you compare it to Bolivia, in fact, Venezuela's reserves were only 24 billion by the time that the oil started to decline in a steady fashion. Today, reserves are a little bit over $13 billion. And the liquid position remains very low. The government also started to liquidate or liquidar existing assets very quickly, and also to reduce, although not eliminate, subsidies to the Caribbean. So for example, the government managed to get Jamaica, Dominican Republic, Uruguay to prepay part of their debt at a discount. And also the government still sold some assets abroad, like for example, a very small refinery in the United States. In addition to this, obviously the Chinese helped, and the Chinese were a critical element in order to provide the kind of financing that the government require for these to confront these bad times. That implied, like in 2015, the region was contracting its GDP a little bit over 0.3% on average. The economic decline of GDP in Venezuela was 6%. Okay, so the impact in economic activity in the country was much larger than the rest of the region. In fact, Venezuela in the last 3 years has almost lost 1/4 of its GDP. So it's a very important economic contraction. And add to this, a collapse in public services. Public services, and this goes to the fiscal side. As I said, the fiscal deficit is close to 20% of GDP. And a lot of it has to do, as this was also true for Argentina, due to these indirect subsidies that you were giving not only to public services, water, electricity, but also in the case of Venezuela to food subsidies that where you were indirectly subsidizing imports for some of the programs that the government was pursuing. But this implied that most of these services, because of the lack of investment, and in some cases of the graft and the corruption behind of these investments, public services started to collapse. So you started 3 years ago, started suffering electricity rationing, particularly in the interior of the country, not in the capital, but very much in the rest of the country. And the same was true with the functioning and the delivery of water services in the country. In addition to that, you had a collapse in security, where the state was increasingly underinvesting in security forces in order to confront a scaling band situation whereby bands in gangs in Venezuela were not only gaining presence and dominating territories, but they were increasing in size. It's like, for example, a gang in Venezuela usually was a gang of 5 or 10 at most. That was a powerful gang. Today we have what we call mega gangs, which can reach up to 150 individuals. So this is this situation in the last 3 years, since Maduro, after Maduro won the elections, and when he came with his declining oil prices. What you've had is this sort of a situation where not only the economy has been collapsing, but you have public services also declining very quickly. That means that social tensions have been going up. Shortages in food last year was 75%. Medicine shortages, 70%. Okay? The average hours that people were spending on lines to get access to basic goods and staples, on average, we've been measuring this, is 5 hours. Okay. 5 hours. 5 hours.
A day.
A day. Okay. On the families. Okay. So at the household level. So what you have is a situation where people are spending more and more time online trying to get access to basic goods and staples. But this is increasingly becoming more conflictive, right? Because what you're doing, or what's happening, is you're contracting imports, right? You don't have an FX system that is working because you have multiple exchange rates. The government doesn't really have dollars to feed into this different FX systems that they have. You have inflation rates going up. So you have less goods, more arbitration, and real income basically collapsing. So that is that people are becoming more and more dependent on accessing the subsidized goods in line, that they need to get in line. But they have less certainty than a year or 2 years ago whether they're going to actually get to that, because you have a group of over 200,000 people who participate on arbitration with regulated products, who actually extract these products from the formal retailers and resells them in a shadow market that is becoming larger and larger. Okay. So what you're starting to see is a very complex story. It's a complex story that, if you look at it from this perspective, it has no reference whatsoever to the rest of the region. I mean, you compare the size of this crisis with what's going on in Brazil, or what's going on in other parts of the region, and what the difference is here is really the size of not only of the imbalances, but the size of the crisis. How is this translating into the political situation? By the time Maduro came to power and Chavez had died from cancer, it was obvious that because of the decline in oil prices, that Chavismo was starting to lose electoral competitiveness. If you correlate, just to give you an idea of this correlation, the correlation between oil prices and Chavez's popularity, okay, was 0.16. The correlation between Maduro's popularity and oil prices is 0.81. Okay? So Chavez, you might think that Chavez is a story about oil. But Chavez was a story more than oil. Maduro is more of an oil story, okay? Which I think is actually interesting to understand. But the truth is that Chavismo was starting to lose electoral competitiveness since Chavez died. And it lost, it won the presidential election by a very slim margin, a very contested margin. And there were, even groups within the opposition that think that it was a fraud and all that. But at the end, when you start comparing the number of votes that Chavismo was getting, it was getting less than what Chavez got at its peak. That is, when it got over 8 million votes, Maduro was able only to win with 7.5 million votes. And Maduro started losing that competitive edge. So he became more and more dependent on the very strong institutional grip that the government had over the judicial branch and over most of the existing powers in Venezuela. But that didn't mean that decline in electoral competitiveness did not continue. And in fact, because of the size of the economic imbalances and the crisis, you had a government that lost the parliamentary elections that we had, or the legislative elections that we had on December 6th, with the opposition gaining 7.8 million votes. Didn't necessarily get to the point where Chavez was in 2012. But the official party, the PSUV, was able only to get 5.4 million votes. And that, because of the electoral system where Chavismo obtained 42% of the vote and the opposition obtained 58% of the vote, that meant that the opposition, because of the electoral system, got a 2/3 majority. Now, at the time of the 2/3 majority on December 6th, the 2/3 majority was in many ways a game changer. Because according to the Venezuelan constitution, and in many ways a 2/3 majority sort of could have kicked in sort of the kind of process that you're seeing in Argentina, or you saw in Argentina and Brazil, of a potential change in government. And what happened was that the 2/3 majority implied basically that the new assembly could reform the constitution unilaterally, could remove existing powers and appoint new judges and appoint new directors to the Electoral Council. And it even implied that they could call for a national constituent assembly. So these were, from all perspectives, the results implied that all of a sudden the power of negotiation and the credible threats that the opposition had vis-a-vis the Maduro presidency were very large and very important. My view at the time was that this electoral result was so important that it could have precipitated a negotiation process between the opposition and the government, given the kind of credible threats that the National Assembly had vis-a-vis the president and Chavismo. But that did not happen. And it did not happen because Chavismo knew exactly that this electoral outcome could threaten their very ability to remain in power with the presidency. And what they did was a very smart move, but very smart move, but not very kosher, in my way, or my point of view, which was to remove out of the 112 deputies that the opposition had obtained, to remove 3 deputies from the indigenous state of the Amazonas, okay, which is the less populous state in the country, but is the most overrepresented state in the country. By doing that, Chavismo was stripping the opposition not necessarily of the 2/3 majority, but at least they were stripping them from the certainty that they had the 2/3 majority. It was a very smart move because if you estimate the 2/3 majority over the number of seats, the opposition lost the 2/3 majority with that decision. If you estimate it over the number of votes of people voting in the legislature, they remained with the 2/3 majority. So you created uncertainty over whether the opposition had it or not, and therefore you reduce the credible threat and the negotiation tools that the opposition had to push for some kind of situation, of solution to the Venezuelan crisis. Secondly, even though the outcome was not very favorable, or not favorable at all for Chavismo, it did not have the meltdown effect after the election over the presidential popularity. I mean, you would have thought that after losing that election the way they did, Maduro's popularity, or what was left of Maduro's popularity, would have plummeted. And it did not plummet. Okay? So Maduro, in fact, during January, February, and March, remained with a level of popularity of close to 32-33%. It has only been in April that you're starting to observe a decline in his popularity, coming down to 27% now. Now, President Santos in Colombia has 28%. Okay, Dilma has 9%. So there's a very an important aspect. And also, the Chavismo decided to pack the court. That is, to a point before the National Assembly was controlled by the opposition, to appoint loyalists in the Supreme Court that would, in fact, interpret any kind of constitutional exit that the opposition would do to block through the Supreme Court any attempt to activate any of the potential options that the opposition had. So here we have a situation where basically we are as of today, despite the size of the imbalances and the implications of the economic situation of a country that is facing very high levels of almost hyperinflation, that is facing an economic contraction that is huge, that is experiencing a contraction in real wages, that basically were most of the gains, the social gains, that there are lost after this, at least in terms of income. So where are we now? We're in a political deadlock, in a stalemate. And the question is this, how stable is this stalemate in this context? I think that there are three different scenarios that are opening up in Venezuela. And they're going to be three very different stories of how the country might evolve in the following months. There is a very important constitutional provision, which is that you can only precipitate a presidential election again before the fourth year of the presidential term. That is, there is a fourth year cutoff, which makes a huge difference for Chavismo on whether you precipitate or not a presidential election. So, for example, if President Maduro resigns or is recalled or is impeached, whatever, before January 10, 2017, you would have to call for a new presidential election. After that fourth year cutoff, the VP stays in power. Unlike Brazil, the VP is not elected. And therefore, it remains as elected as part of the government until the end of the presidential period. So the president cannot remove the VP. In Venezuela, the VP is appointed by the president. That makes a huge difference for Chavismo, because it means that any change, it has to be done after January 10, 2017. So if you look at the political situation, it starts to make sense what Chavismo, from a political perspective, not from a democratic perspective, from a political perspective, it doesn't make sense. Starts to make sense what Chavismo is trying to do, which is basically blocking any possibility of using the existing institutional arrangements to accommodate the political and the social conflict that the country is going through at this point. And their dominant strategy is to hold to the current situation at least until January 10, 2017. You asked me in December, after the election, it looked like the process of political change in Venezuela could have been very smooth. 4 months down the road, it looks like there is a good chance that Chavismo is going to be able to contain the political and the social pressures until January 10, 2017. So that's one scenario where the country is heading, to this sort of containment of the social and economic and political pressures. Second scenario is one that the country has gone through before. In fact, in 2004, under Chavez, which is to activate a recall referendum, right? And this can actually take place, but it requires the opposition to satisfy certain preconditions. First precondition, The opposition is a very successful electoral coalition. It is not a very successful political coalition. Okay. When it comes to elections, they unite, they campaign together, they even have a unified label. When it comes to meet, in terms of consensus around political decisions, different groups view things in different ways because different groups think that the political outcome might favor or not their own leaders in different ways. So you have one group who thinks that the best outcome is a recall referendum. You have another group who thinks that the best solution is a constitutional amendment. And you have another group that thinks that the best solution is a national constituent assembly. And even you have others who think that the best solution is one that they don't control, which is the president should resign. So the precondition for a recall referendum to be activated, which is, by the way, the only exit that is less vulnerable to a decision by the Supreme Court. The amendment can be blocked by the Supreme Court. The National Constituent Assembly can be blocked by the Supreme Court. The recall referendum can be obstructed by the Supreme Court, but it cannot be forbidden by the Supreme Court. Okay. So the first precondition is that you have sort of a united position around the recall referendum. This last week in Venezuela was important political progress on that note. After December 6th, there was an internal rife. And the G4, which is the instance where that's making decisions through consensus mechanism, basically disappeared. And this last week, for the first time, the 4 political groups agreed to activate again the G4. That's a great news for the opposition. But that's not enough. The second condition you require is you need social mobilization. You need political mobilization, which is something that is interesting to look at the polls to understand why is it that you're not getting this. Because in the polls, 80% of the people are saying, we want change. 95% of the people want change. Of those 80%, 95% say they want change through electoral mechanisms. So they want elections. Okay. But when you ask them, are you willing to mobilize, to activate, and by the way, 65% of the population favors the recall referendum. Okay? But when you ask them, are you willing to mobilize? They're not willing to mobilize. That is, they're telling politicians, you have to do your job, and my job is to go to the polls, to the booth, and vote, and I'll do that just as they did in December 6th. So you have an opposition that is constrained by social preferences in how to activate that. But they need to at least gain some social traction in order to get some support, some political support for the recall. And finally, you need to overcome the administrative hurdles to activate the recall referendum. That is, the current rules, you need first of all to collect 1% of signatures to activate the recall. Then you need to verify 100% of that 1% of signatures. And then you can go by and collect 20% of the signatures. And then you have to verify 100% of that 20% of signatures. It's not impossible.
That's a good news.
But it's difficult. It's difficult. So the opposition has that challenge, but it has 8 months to do this, because it makes a difference whether you activate this recall referendum before the 4th year cutoff or after the 4th year cutoff. So that's the second scenario. And the third scenario is one that I think is feasible, it's probable, which is social unrest at a big scale. So far, the government has been able to contain that. And it's been able to contain that because the military has been willing to contain it. And every day the military is in the lines, just making sure that there's no social conflict emerging from the long lines to access basic goods and staples every morning. The problem is that if real wages are contracting the way they are, if you have inflation, if you have less imports, and you have a lot of people engaging in arbitration, it means that you have less products. You have less products in the stores, and you're becoming more dependent on those goods. But you have a conflict with a group of individuals that is close to 200,000 people, what we call in Venezuela bachaqueros. It's a very interesting story, this whole thing about bachaqueros. I don't know what the translation of a bachaquero would be in English. Ant seeker. But what this happens is that bachaquero is the one who controls the access to these goods. So you're starting to observe clashes. They call it organized crime. So you're starting to observe clashes around between the bachaqueros and the non-bachaqueros. Now, this is not happening at scale. That's true. There's still isolated events, very isolated events, that are not happening at scale, and therefore don't have the social traction to precipitate a political situation. Could this scale up? I think it could, but so far it hasn't. Why? Well, there are many reasons. One reason has to do with the fact that the military is involved. Secondly, that these bachaqueros are very well organized. They have information systems that, they're really 3.0, okay? And they're armed. So people fear them, okay? But the military is a key actor here. And then thirdly, you don't have, the opposition doesn't have the grassroots. Just as the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt did when you had the scarcity of food and staples in Egypt, or in Argentina with the piqueteros during the crisis with the Caja de Conversión and all that. So you don't have that kind of element going on. So the likelihood of this scenario is I think, is not. It's there. It's obvious. It can happen, but it's not necessarily going to happen. So I'll finish with the following idea. I think Latin America overall has coped extraordinarily well politically with the change in the terms of trade and the declining commodity prices. Democratic institutions have been working. In the case of Brazil, we can debate a little bit about that. I have my own position on what's happening there. But you have this, at least in Argentina, the elections worked. In Bolivia, Evo was constrained by a referendum to extend term limits. In Peru, because you have no term limits, you have alternation of power. So the region is sort of coping with this pretty well. In some places better than others. Obviously, when you compare Brazil to some of the others, it doesn't look as good, but it's coping. So institutions seem to be working. In the case of Venezuela, I think it's very different. It's a case where this process of how you're going to cope politically with this external shock, the size of this external shock, is going to lag, and in fact it's going to be a very slow and very difficult process than what we initially thought after the legislative elections in December 6th. So I leave it there, we'll say, for questions.
Thank you.
A question that I have that still puzzles me, and is that 42% of that the Chavismo won in December 6th. Given the scenario that you portray, collapse of the economy, total tragedy, 42% is actually very surprising, right? Then the 32% of still support for popularity ranks of Maduro, who's not a particularly charismatic character, compared to 8% for Dilma, right? And then I was thinking, well, it must be because when you say poverty declined in many places in Latin America, inequality also declined in many places. But Brazil is one case, right? You could say that maybe in Venezuela, both poverty and inequality declined during Chavez period. Probably that is true, no? But if that is the case, that doesn't explain why Dilma has 8% of popularity and Maduro has 32. So I wonder if what is different in Venezuela is the level of class conflict, resentment, emotional attachment to an idea that is more like Peronismo than the PT. And that is because otherwise it's difficult to explain this behavior, the level of support that they still have. And these are probably that 32% or 40% of the population that is still supporting them one way or the other. Maybe the proportion of the population, the sector of the population that you would expect social unrest from, not the upper middle classes and the middle classes. So I wonder if that is.
That's a very good question. I think I agree with you. Chavismo is more of a Peronista story than a PT story. And in fact, I've written about this, and I'm very, very convinced and proved that it's a consolidated party. It has its weakness, but it's there. But what I do think is that it's not, so any change in Venezuela has to cope with that reality, which is Chavismo exists. Whether you like it or not, they are there. And they're the most important political minority in the country. That's absolutely true. When you analyze the elections, you have the largest political minority is Chavismo. Doesn't mean that the opposition is not an electoral majoritarian coalition as of today. That's true. But when you look at it at the party level, the story is different. You have different parties with different support levels. So in many ways, the system is not clear right now that you have politically a majoritarian party. You have, from electoral position, you have a majoritarian coalition on behalf of the opposition. And I think this is important. Because if you look at, if for example Chavismo makes it to the 4th year cutoff, and their factions within the leadership of Chavismo is absolutely crucial, because there's no way they can survive the electoral cycle of elections for governors, for mayors, and even our next presidential election under the current situation. So even Chavismo is under a lot of pressure from within to push for some changes. Could this happen? It could happen. You know, it's plausible. And in fact, I think that's why the internal conflict that is so common within the Peronista party, where you have different factions and you have different leaders, which is coming, you're starting to observe that in Chavismo too. So you have a faction right now that is close to a general, a former general who was part of the 92 movement, military movement from Chavez. You have other groups that are close to the governor of Aragua. You have other groups that are close to Chavez's daughter. I mean, they're competing groups. Okay? Now, I think it's important, and this is sort of the dilemma that I think the Chavista have, which is, how do I change the economy without damaging my political brand? Because that's their most important dilemma, which they haven't solved. Because they think introducing market reforms, for example, particularly with removing price controls, opening up at least unifying the FX system and all that.
But couldn't they have actually use the opposition and do it in tandem with the opposition and then blame the opposition for the reform?
Well, that's not happening. That's not happening because the opposition doesn't want to be blamed for the cost of that adjustment. So what you have is again, I agree with you that you still have, the president is not as popular, but doesn't mean that the brand, the Chavista brand, is totally diluted.
It's
a serious risk.
Quick question. Yes, a quick question, because it was that thing that you found that in surveys that people were not willing to mobilize. I wonder if it does not reflect apathy, but fear of lower class violence.
That's a very good question. Also, it does. I think it reflects. People know that the risk of mobilizing might end up in some kind of violence.
What is striking, and I thought you only brought it in at the end, is really the question of the military. If one looks at Venezuelan history, one sees very clearly the continuing role of the military as an element in the situation. Betancourt was the exception, and that lasted over a period of time in which you had elections and they became increasingly fractionalized, and Acción Democrática never had the original power in order to create a system that would work. I am struck by the fact that there is a fourth possibility, which I think ultimately will happen, and that's going to depend on the military. That in some ways a change will only happen under conditions in which you get a group within the military saying this is not working and we have to do something about it. Because trying to reform the economy is an impossibility. Trying to reform an economy where you have such a difference in the black market exchange rate and the exchange rate, which is finally devalued, is much greater than any place else in the world. The situation is exactly as it has been so frequently in Venezuela, a decision which is made in part regionally, Caracas versus the rest of the country. In part, it's also, it seems to me, a question of who in the military has a view. Chavez, we have to remember, came out of the military and managed to gain control because he was a military man in accordance with earlier history. To some degree, Chavez's rise was in the frustration that happened in terms of the former political system breaking down, and in which you were unable to make it work. I think that in some ways, although it is different from what has happened in other countries, it again will be the military that will have to make a decision. And it has to be a broad government in order to deal with all of these economic problems.
Right.
There just isn't any other way that you can do it. The one good piece of information is that Venezuela has lots of natural gas, and exploiting that and taking advantage of that will be an amazing source of prosperity.
Of gas or oil? Gas.
Yes.
Gas. No, I agree. There's a former president that was a very famous Venezuelan historian, Ramon J. Velázquez, who used to call the armed forces in Venezuela the historical party. What he basically was saying there, that there was no regime change in Venezuela that was not done under the approval of the I think my third scenario, the social breakdown, okay, or the social unrest, is a scenario. In the first scenario, I think Chavismo is trying to control the change, although it's a slower pace, more controlled, more closed. The second scenario is one where the opposition is able to overcome its collective action problems and increase the pressure. But in the third one, I think it's a scenario where things break down, definitely, and the military are forced to be in a position where they're going to have to look at how to solve this issue. They can do it in many ways. I mean, it could be an Egyptian story. Okay, it could perfectly be something very much like Egypt today. Or it could be a story where the military forces some kind of negotiation between both factions, and they play a mediating role. Or it could be a traditional a situation where they're forced to step in and then call for new elections, but you never know if they're so the whole typical story. I think yes, there is a good chance that the military might be in that position. Now, however, what is the military? The military in Venezuela has changed a lot. I would love to write this book, actually, just like my dear friend Al Stepan wrote about the Brazilian military in the 1970s. I would love to write this book about the Venezuelan militaries in the beginning of the millennium, because it's a fascinating story. It's not necessarily a nice story, but it's a really interesting story, right? But it's changed in many ways. Now, in the legislative election, everyone thought that they would not, the Chavismo was not going to recognize the election, the 2/3 majority. And at the end, the military came out and said they have the 2/3 majority. Okay. Now, the military is saying we will not mess up with elections. Now, we don't want to get involved in interpreting constitutional rules. We'll leave that to the Supreme Court. That's exactly what they're saying. So they're trying to maximize the electoral process as a natural means to solve the political conflict. Second element they're trying to do is maximize rents. They are deeply involved in accessing rents. Unlike Chile, Chile is a very civilized place because it's not like militaries don't have access to rents. You know, we think, oh, Chile is so transparent. Well, but they have access to rent. 10% of the copper revenues go to the military, right? I mean, it's written. The thing is that it's ordered. You know, it's institutionalized. The rent. In the case of Venezuela, no. You get rents wherever they are. So you go to the oil sector, you get the rents. You go to the arbitration of the exchange rate, there they are. You go to imports for food, and there they're dominating that. You go to the border, and they're there with the gasoline. So it's a situation where they're maximizing rent access. So this puts the society in a very difficult position, because at the end, it's an institution that needs politicians in society to discipline and institutionalize again that. And that's going to be very difficult. And in fact, I think it's the most important challenge that the country has. In terms of economic recovery, I agree with you. I think the economic recovery in Venezuela can be very fast. Not only because you have access to natural resources, because it's also you have a private sector, whatever left of it, that is not leveraged at all. So they could, anyway, but I'm not going to go into that. But I agree with you.
Yes. I have a couple questions, Professor Penfold. You mentioned the unwillingness of the Venezuelan people to mobilize, and I wonder, does it have to do with the perception of the Venezuelan people that they don't have although they have a very effective opposition, a coalition in terms of elections, can they count on a cohesive and organized and opposition that brings a solution to the crisis that we have today? Because we have the resignation proposed by factors of the opposition, and then we have the RICO referendum, the reform and the Constituent Assembly, and Venezuelan people are spending hours looking for food and staples, and they're wondering what's going to happen. Henry Ramos, the president of the National Assembly, said last month that there was a precocity in the general population about what's going on or about the outcome of the situation, given the timeline for January 10th that will basically make it possible to move forward with the RICO referendum. So does it have to do also the unwillingness to mobilize with the perception of the Venezuelan people that they're not voting for Maduro, but although they're voting for the opposition,
I think
they don't feel...
It's a combination of things. I mean, I don't think there's a single factor. The fact is that there was a portion of the population 3 years ago that mobilized. And out of that outcome, you have two of the most important politicians in jail.
Yeah.
You have over 80 students who are in prison. And the government was making sure to cross the message that it was risky, that, you know, it had consequences. And it keeps saying that it has consequences, even though these students and these politicians are, you know, their human rights violation there is so obvious that we don't even have to discuss that. But, so that's one factor. I think another factor has to do with the fact that people are busy. People in Cuba, ¿cómo resuelve? ¿Qué hiciste? ¿Resolviste? ¿No resolviste? Bueno, Venezuela es igual. ¿Resuelve o no resuelve? Okay? So you're solving. Okay, that's the expression. So you're solving. It takes time. It takes effort. It takes connections. No, but it takes information. It takes information. It takes connections. So that's another factor. And then I also think that there's what you're saying is true, which is people believe that the opposition is not that credible when it comes to the political, where they're standing politically. I mean, it's a good, so they need to work on it. So they need to make a credible commitment in order for people to say, okay, you're really committed. And I think that has to do a lot with leadership, with political leadership, which, you know, I think they have good leaders overall, but they haven't been able to show that kind of commitment. So again, it's not one factor. I think it's a combination of them.
I also had another question, and also I wanted to add to that comment. I also believe that the opposition at this point, although they have a lot of popular support, they're not aware of the historical moment. There are 30 million people suffering because of this crisis, and yet we don't see, we haven't seen so far, and you mentioned that, a powerful opposition from the National Assembly showing the people that they have such a strong decision-making power to change what's going on soon. And also you say that given the scenario of social unrest, who do you think will take care of the country, or who will hold power, considering the situation we have in the military?
Just answer that question with Alice. You know, again, going back to your initial question, which has to do with your second question, I think the other thing is the middle class in Venezuela. The middle class is leaving the country. They're exiting. They're not voicing anymore, and they're doing it in a massive way.
Voicing with their feet.
Voicing with their feet, yes. And the lower sectors, you know, I think they're in this, yeah, they're solving. You know, they're trying to survive on a very difficult situation. Now, the opposition needs, in terms of the assembly and the role of the assembly, it's very easy to, you know, I think in January they privileged. I would have thought, you know, but it's very easy to go back. It's very easy to go back, and it's very, you know, they're hard choices. But in January 13, when they were installed, the assembly was installed, the opposition had a huge dilemma, which is, how do we install this assembly and include the 3 deputies from the Amazons that have been stripped from their seat? So, because they could have chosen not to install the assembly unless the 112 deputies which included the Amazonian deputies, were sworn in. Instead, they decided that they were going to sworn in 2 different stages. First, 109 deputies, and then 3 deputies. The Supreme Court ruled that the assembly was in desacato, was disloyal. Okay, and the assembly decided to accept the ruling of the Supreme Court. The moment the assembly approved the ruling of the Supreme Court, well, they approved the Supreme Court. They approved of the temporary strip of the 3 deputies, and there you lost all your bargaining power, because de facto you lost the majority, the supermajority. Now it's quite dramatic.
Okay, on that sad note, I think we have to, it has been actually very illuminating, very judicious.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.